In the 1840s, the United States was growing rapidly. This city, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and other industrial centers rose in sections of the North that a few years earlier had been wilderness. In the South, huge farms called plantations occupied much of the land. This plantation house stands in Louisiana. Slaves planted and harvested crops grown on plantations. West of the Mississippi River lay the Great Plains. There, Indians hunted buffaloes that roamed in vast herds. Because American settlers thought this part of the United States was unsuitable for farming, they crossed the plains to the far west. Settlements like the one shown here grew up in the Oregon country, a region claimed by both England and the United States. Other Americans traveled to California, where early Spanish settlers had built missions like this one. Mexico controlled California in the 1840s. Many Americans hoped that California and other western lands would become part of the United States. By the 1840s, frontier settlements like St. Louis, Missouri, had grown into cities. St. Louis was a supply center for Americans heading into lands west of the Mississippi River. In 1844, the United States included 26 states, shown here in light green. Other United States territory is shown in dark green. The Oregon country, claimed by England and the United States, lay to the northwest. Mexico controlled lands to the southwest except for Texas. Texas had won its independence from Mexico in 1836. This old drawing shows the town of Austin. Like much of Texas, Austin was settled by Americans. In 1836, Texas asked to become a state. Statehood was granted in 1845. Many American pioneers moving west felt strong ties to their country. They wanted their new homes to come under the protection of the United States. John C. Fremont, sent by the government to map the far west, wrote enthusiastic reports about lands he visited. These reports, read by thousands of Americans, inspired widespread interest in the West. This old illustration shows the Senate in the 1840s. Some senators and other government leaders, called expansionists, wanted to increase the size of the United States by bringing western lands under American control. Expansionists believed it was the nation's destiny to extend from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Many Americans agreed. In 1844, James K. Polk was supported by expansionists for the presidency. After Polk was elected, Texas became a state. Mexico had never completely given up its claims to Texas, and war broke out. Mexican and American troops clash in Texas. American forces won this battle. After several other victories, Americans controlled much of the territory from Texas to California. Polk and the expansionists decided to force Mexico to surrender these lands. American troops march in triumph through Mexico City. With its capital city in American hands, Mexico surrendered. A treaty signed in 1848 granted the United States the lands shown here in orange. Several years later, through the Gadsden Purchase, Americans acquired more land from Mexico. The purchase established the permanent boundary shown here in yellow. In 1846, a treaty with England had granted the Americans complete control over the portion of the Oregon country shown here. covered wagons heading west line up to cross the Missouri River. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. The news spread around the world, setting off a huge migration known as the Gold Rush. During 1849, thousands of gold seekers, called 49ers, set out for California. Like this man, many gold seekers swirled sand, gravel, and water in a pan to find bits of the precious metal. In the early days of the gold rush, gold was so plentiful that large quantities were found this way. The gold rush transformed San Francisco, California from a small trading center into the city shown here. Gold drew so many people to California that by 1850 its population was more than 10 times larger than it was in 1846. This portrait shows Brigham Young, leader of a religious group known as the Mormons. Driven from their homes by people who disagreed with their beliefs, the Mormons traveled west in search of religious freedom. In 1847, they began to settle in an isolated part of what is today Utah. In lands no one else wanted, the Mormons hoped to be left free to practice their religion. Throughout the mid-1800s, settlement west of the Mississippi River was deepening old divisions between the North and the South. The major issue was whether to permit slavery in the West. This painting shows a slave auction. The South wanted to extend slavery into Western territories. Northerners disagreed. Bloody fighting broke out in Kansas over the slavery question. Finally, slavery was outlawed there. But conflict between North and South continued, leading the nation into war. The Civil War began in 1861. Here, Northern troops advanced toward a Southern stronghold in Mississippi. Northern victory in 1865 ensured an end to slavery. Few Civil War battles occurred in the West. During the war, prospectors continued searching for gold and other minerals. Here in Nevada and in other western regions, prospectors discovered mineral wealth in deserts and high mountains. Wild rumors of gold near Pikes Peak in Colorado launched a second gold rush. Thousands of people headed west, some in wagons bearing the slogan, "Pikes Peak or Bust." Many returned empty-handed. But not all stories of mineral wealth in the West were exaggerated. Mining towns like Deadwood, South Dakota, sprang up almost overnight near mineral deposits. Many of the noisy, crowded settlements turned into ghost towns when the mines ran out. Others, like Deadwood, survived. As settlement increased, the need for transportation connecting east and west also grew. In 1858, stagecoaches, like this one, began carrying passengers and mail between Missouri and California. Even with this system, crossing the country took nearly a month. Stagecoach travel was always difficult and sometimes dangerous. Heavy snows frequently blocked roads that in good weather sent up choking clouds of dust. Outlaw attack was a constant threat. The building of a railroad linking east and west promised faster, safer, more comfortable transportation. The great project, begun in 1863, employed thousands of men. These workers are laying tracks east from California. Other crews, starting in Nebraska, worked west. 6 years later, workers celebrated the meeting of the two rail lines at Promontory, Utah. Eventually, other rail lines connected east and west. Many settlements grew up along railroads, which also helped create a huge cattle industry. Millions of cattle once roamed wild across Texas. Because cattle brought high prices in the east, Texans began rounding them up and driving them to the nearest railroad. Cowboys kept constant watch over the cattle during the long drives. Some drives lasted more than 3 months and extended 1,000 miles. Cowboys were excellent riders, skilled at roping and handling cattle. Many came from the South. A few traveled from as far away as Great Britain. About a third of the cowboys were Mexican-American or black. Most black cowboys were former slaves. During long drives, cowboys spent up to 14 hours a day in the saddle. Where trails ended and railroads began, cattle towns like Dodge City, Kansas, developed. After long drives, cowboys spent many days in wild celebration here. Although cattle towns attracted drifters, gunfighters, and outlaws, increasing numbers of law-abiding citizens settled in such places during the 1870s. To open more land to settlers, the government decided to restrict Indians to certain lands called reservations. Here, horses drink from a stream on a reservation in South Dakota. For centuries, the Indians of the Great Plains freely roamed the grasslands, hunting buffaloes. They depended on buffalo meat for food and on buffalo hides for clothing and shelter. In the Great Plains and elsewhere in the West, Indians feared that confinement to reservations would destroy their way of life. In anger, some tribes attacked American settlements. The Army struck back. In this painting, cavalry troops destroy an Indian camp. Bitter fighting between Indians and the Army lasted many years. In Montana, near the Little Bighorn River, Indians battled cavalry commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Indians won the battle, called Custer's Last Stand. Such Indian victories were rare. By the late 1870s, defeat seemed certain for the Indians. But some leaders, like Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, refused to move to a reservation. He and part of his tribe fled. For months, they outmaneuvered the Army. They turned north, hoping to escape into Canada. But finally, starving and exhausted, the tribe was captured near the Canadian border. At the surrender, Chief Joseph described the sufferings of his people and said, "I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. I will fight no more forever." The grasslands of the Great Plains attracted more settlers as Indian tribes were confined to reservations. Since 1862, a law called the Homestead Act had offered settlers free land in the plains. Homesteaders faced many difficulties, including scorching summers and freezing winters. Wood was so scarce that many families built homes by digging into a ridge or the side of a hill. Walls were made of blocks of grassy soil called sod. Such houses, known as soddies, provided some shelter. But inside, dirt and grass often fell from the roof. During storms, leaking roofs sometimes collapsed. Homesteaders like these struggled to grow crops in the dry soil. Eventually, improved irrigation and farming methods and the invention of new machinery enabled settlers to establish successful farms. For years, free land in the plains lured homesteaders from as far away as Europe. On September 16, 1893, one of several frantic rushes for land began in what is today Oklahoma. 100,000 homesteaders raced each other to claim 6 million acres. Some traveled on horseback, others in wagons. By the mid-1890s, settlers had spread across most of the United States. The great period of westward movement was ending, but years of development lay ahead. Today in Houston, Texas, skyscrapers tower above freeways and city streets. States west of the Mississippi River include some of America's fastest-growing regions. These states also provide mineral riches for the entire nation. On the grounds of the Oklahoma Capitol, derricks rise above oil wells. Early pioneers thought the Great Plains could not support farms. Today, farms here in Montana and elsewhere in the plains produce much of the world's wheat. The lights of Seattle, Washington, glitter in the night. In 1851, settlers, drawn by the chance to build a new life, founded this city near the Pacific coast. For more than a century, pioneering efforts pushed American settlement steadily westward. Overcoming many hardships, Americans built a nation extending from sea to sea.